18 editor. We welcome you, sir. Dr. Dattesh Prabhu Parulekar, strategic expert, Goa University, Panjim. We welcome you, sir. In conversation with Ms. Nayan Anand, security analyst, Prague, Czech Republic, who is with us online. We welcome you, madam. I request
just to inform the audience that it's our pleasure that today Nayan has joined from Czech Republic, and she is working for an organization called Pinkerton. Pinkerton is one of the leading think tanks and the strategic service provider in the world, which also one of the premier strategic service providing organizations, which supported John F. Kennedy also. It's a US-based organization, and currently she is involved in one of the major humanitarian services, that is shifting Ukrainian population from the war-hit areas. So one of our Indian women is there in providing services to shift the Ukrainians from their war zone.
I request our moderator to take forward the session.
Hello, am I audible? Yeah. Nayan, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Can you hear us, Nayan?
Yes, am I audible?
Yeah, we can hear you. Thank you. Yeah, so. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We kick off this session at the Mangaluru Literature Festival with a discussion on the Ukraine conflict, and even as we slept last night, the UN General Assembly has passed a resolution suspending Russia's membership of the UN Human Rights Council. Now, there have been around 12 votes since the invasion of Ukraine in the last week of February, 11 or 12 votes, and in all the 11 and 12 votes, India has abstained. India has sought to abstain itself. But the interesting thing about this particular vote, which happened last night, was that the abstention does not in any way help Russia. It helps the US or the Western powers because the absentees are not counted. It is either yes vote or a no vote which is counted, and Russia lobbied extensively, even in the UN General Assembly, to get the India vote. Then there was also lobbying from the US side, their Secretary of State speaking to his Indian counterpart here in Delhi. But India's abstention, though might be seen as a support to the US, is a qualified support, that India has made a statement saying that this vote ideally should have been vetted by the Council itself, Human Rights Council, before being put to vote before the UN General Assembly. This has been a very interesting one and a half month, say, the way the entire geopolitics has evolved because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And to discuss this and a lot more, we have Dr. Parulekar from Goa University. Nayan is there, in Prague, the Czech Republic. Dr. Parulekar, with your permission, should we first go to Nayan, because as the US calls it, boots on the ground we have. So Nayan, thank you very much for joining us from Prague. So as I understand that your organization and you are primarily involved in risk management. That's one of the issues that you look at. And since you have been there, would you be able to explain to us and give us a lowdown on how exactly has situation evolved in Ukraine in the last one and a half month?
Thank you for your question, and thank you for having me. Ever since Russia attacked and invaded Ukraine on Feb 24th, that is, we were given this task to analyze the situation using these new age awesome tools that we have. That's satellite imagery, but also, you know, traffic control, and basically online eyes on the ground itself. From what we can see is that on 24th, since Kyiv exactly wasn't the first place to be attacked, the seriousness of the situation was not that prominent. People were still debating, even on the night of the 24th, if Russia was going to invade Ukraine or not. But it did, in fact. So ever since then, there has been a high influx of not just refugees moving to Moldova or Poland or Slovakia, but there's also been a huge internally displaced population that has moved from the East Ukraine to the West. Because even as of today, the Western Ukraine is still comparatively safer because it's really just the Eastern Ukraine that's at the forefront of most of the attacks by Russia. So we were mostly involved with helping these refugees. We had a contact center phone, and they would contact us, and we were redirecting them towards Poland and Slovakia and Hungary and all the other borders. And essentially, we were informing them about the wait time. And it was really, not to sound too dramatic in a way, but it was really heart-wrenching to see the wait time, the car crashes on all of these borders. Because we had the access to the satellite imagery, we could see how many trucks had been attacked, how many civilian vehicles had been attacked, and all of these borders were jam-packed. As of today, there are 4.2 million Ukrainian refugees in all of the neighboring states, even to the Czech Republic, some people making their way to Belgium, leaving everything behind. And what was even heartwarming was that the men population weren't at that point allowed to go out of Ukraine. So what we essentially saw were all these fathers and husbands and brothers just, you know, coming to the border, just dropping off their families, waving them goodbye, and coming back to fight for their nation. So it's been a difficult situation for so far, and it continues to be so as well to this day. But
we'll come back to you on that refugee thing, especially on the evacuation of the Indian population there. Do you think, you know, the way the Americans pulled out of Afghanistan and the two wars over the last 2 decades, and I'm asking because one of your initial papers I've read is on the Indo-US strategic ties, has in a way manifested itself in the way the geopolitics is shaping up, and is an the Ukrainian invasion in a way is a manifestation of that? Yeah.
If you look at the way in which the geopolitics has been evolving for the last 2 decades, I think one of the most important trends we can see is the progressive diminishing or decline of American prestige. The lack of American credibility with its partners, with its allies, and even globally, the ability of the United States to be able to enforce its writ, the lack of it is coming home to roost. We saw what happened in Syria, where for all the rights and wrongs, President Obama laid out a red line. And he told Bashar al-Assad, if you use chemical weapons, we will proceed with regime change. Now, whether or not regime change is good or bad is a different matter. I'm not getting into the value proposition of it. But the United States obviously had evidence that chemical weapons were used, and they did not proceed when the Russians called their bluff. Similarly, the manner in which 2 decades of US presence in Afghanistan ended in such embarrassment definitely has left the likes of Russia and many other what we call as recalcitrant elements within the international system definitely emboldened that the Americans have limits to how far they'll go. And I would go back to another instance of where Russia draws its strength from. In 2008, when Georgia next door to Ukraine, and very interestingly also a transit country between Europe and Russia, when they became over adventurous and they did a military exercise in Russia, Russia hit them back. And again then, neither NATO nor the US could come to their rescue. So this clearly laid it very clear and very bare for President Putin that if he wanted to give punishment to countries in his periphery, there will be no substantive help coming. And as a result of that, we are seeing this increasing disruptive power of Russia, which is getting amplified. Russia may not be a constructive actor, but Russia definitely is a very tactical, disruptive actor on the world stage. And the lack of the United States and the West to be able to hold them accountable is only making things worse.
Dr. Datesh, another point, even when you talked about NATO, some of the NATO allies have been very critical of countries like Germany and France also, because of their dependence on the Russian energy, gas. So in that way, I think, do you think that this entire, the globe, within the globe, the stage has shifted a little bit towards the west of Eurasia, because after the Second World War, I think there were only 2 occasions when actually the European subcontinent, they experienced war. One was in Serbia, if I remember, 90s, and the other is this time around when we are seeing a very clear invasion. So you think that this has shifted completely?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we actually see is, now one of the things that we were always hearing for the last few years was how the strategic center of gravity has shifted away from the Euro-Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific. And therefore, everything was being discussed in the terms of China and the Indo-Pacific. But there is also a lingering sense of, dysfunctionality with regard to Eurasia and the Eurasian landmass that keeps coming back to roost. Now, if you look at the West, although we keep talking of the West as being one monolithic entity, let's remember that again for the last 2 decades or so, the Europeans and the Americans actually have been drifting apart. I go back to George W. Bush and his ideologue, Bob Kagan, who once famously said, although the Europeans and the Americans are lumped together and called as one entity, the West, if the Europeans are from Venus, the Americans are from Mars. So effectively saying, the others may think we have the same value system, but possibly we don't have that. And you see that increasingly in the strategic landscape, where European countries are taking a very transactional, very individualistic approach to many issues, and one of them obviously is Russia, because Russia is on their border. That's something you have to coexist and live with. After the Ukraine war is over, what's going to change? Russia is still going to be the next door neighbor of Europe. And so Europeans need to find a modus vivendi of transacting with Russia, whereas the Americans can afford to do this fly in and fly out kind of parachuting business. And so actually I think the West is getting more wedged, and that is leaving the West as a very weak actor and actually strengthening this emerging axis which we call as the Sino-Russian axis.
And then on that note, coming back to you, you have been very closely monitoring the migrant situation there, people who have been displaced. What is it that you're hearing about Bucha? Because it has been in the news reports, there have been satellite images, and probably, that has been one turning point in this conflict where the Russians have, the US has been able to impress upon a lot of countries to actually take a stand, rather take a more liberal stand than a realistic stand in this particular conflict. So what is it that you've been hearing from Bucha? Any reports or any images that you have seen there?
Definitely, apart from, the pictures that are being circulated of those 5 victims with their hand tied, it sends, we have seen some images, we have seen pictures of bodies lying around, and I think Ukraine, when it labels the Bucha as a massacre, as a genocide, I think we would completely agree, at least based on the pictures that we have seen. They have been extremely horrific, and this has been a very crucial point in the Russia-Ukraine war, because it has shown the brutality of Russia. So far, whatever areas of Ukraine that Russia has attacked, at least to show that they were not really after the civilians. They have made these humanitarian corridors to let out the civilians out while they they attacked the Ukrainian soldiers directly, but the Bucha massacre has turned it completely in 180 degrees because they have directly attacked civilians, and there are pictorial evidence that's been circulating everywhere to support Ukraine's claim that this is indeed a genocide.
Okay, Dr. Satish, you know, this entire conflict has also brought a lot of spotlight on India. And diplomats have been calling India a swing state, swinging from one end to the other. How do you think that India has managed its contradictions? I mean, you have these compulsions that India's trade with the US has grown over the years. I think what I have read is around $150 billion vis-a-vis $8 billion that we trade with Russia. But we have these very long-standing ties with Russia. So how do you think, and interestingly this time around we see, apart from a few skirmishes within the country on the credit for bringing back the Indians from there, but more or less there has been a sort of consensus, political consensus, diplomatically also within the community, the way this entire crisis has been handled by India. So how do you think that India has performed as a swing state?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question because there are two concepts that are normally associated with India as a rising power. The one that we are normally, it's a mainstay thing that we're used to, is to talk of India as a middle power, and how India as a middle power is trying to calibrate its rise by navigating through many of the angularities and competitions that exist at a systemic structural level in the world. And in this current instance, India is being, as you rightly said, being looked at as a swing power, somebody who can actually move the needle on this point. And I find this very interesting because while everyone highlights the role of India as a member of the UN Security Council, it's not as if we are some veto-wielding member or something who can actually, make a drastic change. But what has brought India into the limelight is first the very fact that India has been able to pioneer an approach which is very unique, which is we took from the very outset a human security and a humanitarian approach from day one. The world has been quite impressed in the way in which India not only evacuated its own citizens, but also brought back citizens of neighboring countries who were also, making impassioned pleas. Every time India voted, as you rightly said, India abstained on almost every vote, we followed that vote up with a decisive statement that from day one talked about the humanitarian security aspect of this conflict. And at the same time, while we were not talking of getting involved into any kind of, mediation, the very fact that the Ukrainians initially through Zelensky, and more recently when Sergei Lavrov came to India, his suggestion that Russia would not be averse to India being some kind of a mediator actually also enhanced India's prestige. Now, India has three broad problems as it navigates the situation, and it's trying to balance all three. As you rightly said, with the United States, our trade has gone up sevenfold in the last 2 decades. But the bottom line remains, it is still trade limited in a few aspects. If you take out largely, LNG and you take out defense, then it really kind of reduces. So there is the problem of productivizing our relationship with the United States, the same way as the US has a broad-based relationship with China. With Russia, we have a very narrow, kind of trade that is largely driven by energy and of course largely by defense. There we are trying to diversify our relationship, and that is why you see we don't want to, shrug the Russians off. We have constantly maintained that we will work with the Russians on this score. And in all this, we should not forget the China factor, because we want to use productivization with the United States and diversification with Russia to achieve our third pillar, which is a stable relationship with China, because only that can deliver us a peace dividend which we need for the next 1 or 2 decades. So what we have done is used our alliances, used our partners, and engaged all, whether it's the Europeans, whether it's the Russians, the Americans, to be able to achieve these three objectives: productivization, diversification, and stabilization.
Okay. Now, you brought in that China point, which is very interesting. And there have been a little difference in opinion, I would say, some of the diplomats, when we talk about China. Sham Saran, who's foreign secretary, he has been saying that India may be looking at the nightmare scenario, what he calls, the US deciding that its interests are limited to the Eurasia region, as it has, shown in its withdrawal, hasty withdrawal from Afghanistan. And India has to formulate its strategy vis-a-vis how it needs to deal with China. It needs certain leverage, the Russian leverage in dealing with China. Then we have Shiv Shankar Menon, former NSA, who thinks that the center of gravity of the geopolitics has shifted conclusively to Asian region, that this entire conflict may not have a very long-term impact. It has already settled the way it has, and it is going to be China-centric. So how do you look at that, these views?
Yeah, I mean, both of these views have the merit. Of course, the second view that Shiv Shankar Menon carries is quite clearly plausible to all of us. I mean, just look at some of the geo-economic, kind of trends and patterns emerging. It's very clear that the Indo-Pacific is going to be the shinazar of attention. Everybody's attention is going to be on the Indo-Pacific, because that's where the bustling economies are, that's where the demographics are, that's where the markets are, that's where the investment potential is. So in every which way, the Indo-Pacific is important. And as you rightly said, it's looking like this whole conflict now is going to settle down. And all that remains is probably for some kind of an accommodated, negotiated settlement that will extricate people out of this conflict. Now, the point is, I still feel that the United States has not quite been able to settle its own internal debate over Eurasia versus the Indo-Pacific. They have quite clearly talked of a pivot to the Indo-Pacific, but that pivot to the Indo-Pacific is still very, very contradictory. Going back to Obama's pivot to Asia, all the way up to Trump declaring the Indo-Pacific, and now Biden declaring that he will actually get involved. So I think India's best way to exact leverage is in terms of, one, to grow its own autonomous capacities, which India right now is doing. Because unless you bring capacities to a table, you can't simply talk of somebody else helping you. And secondly, we will have to ensure that we keep a very nuanced position where we draw on whatever we can from the United States through the Quad and through maritime cooperation, at the same time ensuring that our relationship with Russia is not disturbed. That equilibrium will not be easy to find. It will always be a challenge for our diplomats. But that is why I go back to saying that we are trying to diversify our relationship with Russia so that there are more stakes and more leverage in that relationship, except only for the military part. So for example, the Russian Far East. If you see, one of the big opening, unlocking of potential in this entire conflict is we actually looking to use this opportunity to operationalize the Chennai-Vladivostok economic corridor. And if oil starts flowing on a more regular basis, then possibly this is going to be a trajectory and alignment where we will have leverage both with the United States through the Quad and at the same time also keep Russia interested. So this is going to have to be our play in the Indo-Pacific. For us, it cannot be a black or white situation. As a rising power calibrating its options, we will have to look at shades of gray.
Going back to then, I'll come back to this China question again to you, Dr. Pavlikar. A couple of colleagues of mine who have been working with a few companies who operate out of Germany, big pharmaceutical companies, they've been telling me that some of the refugees who have been driven out of Ukraine, they have even been given shelter by people or their colleagues in the same companies. How is the situation, the refugee situation evolving? And it certainly has been stretching the countries like Poland and Germany to the limits. How many and how much can they accommodate?
Thank you for the question. That's a very good question. For sure, as I mentioned before, that 4.2 million Ukrainians are as refugees currently in the EU, and certainly a lot of the Eastern Bloc, but also Germany and France and Belgium have been very accommodating to these refugees. It is indeed true that a lot of people have been offering their homes to these refugees, even providing them with services, jobs like, as a cleaning service or the like. So people have really opened their hearts and welcomed the refugees. The states in the EU, they have made public transportation for them free, for example. Also meals have been accommodated. So the countries are really going above and beyond to help the Ukrainians. But it is true that a month plus inside the war, and there have some questions about how much can we expand our resources definitely are rising. Because we need to realize that countries like Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, for example, they're not very big countries. They don't have that much resources to extend to external help. So definitely, slowly, people are still in the headspace and to help the refugees, and they have been very kind with it. But definitely, there's already some debate about how long can we continue this and how long the war is going to extend.
Thank you, Nan. Coming back to this China question, when the US National Deputy Secretary of State Dalip Singh, who's said to be the architect of these sanctions which are imposed on Russia, he was here. And at one point in time, the US diplomat seems to be livid with the stand that India had initially taken. He had even said that there will be consequences for countries who actively attempt to circumvent the sanctions. And his argument vis-a-vis the Russian foreign minister's argument, who was here at the same point in time, his argument was that, if I quote him, that no one should kid themselves. Russia is going to be the junior partner in this relationship with China, the way it is evolving, he says. And the more leverage that China gains over Russia, the less favorable that is for India. You see a point in this argument? You see there is substance in this argument. India needs to look at it very carefully.
Definitely, there is some substance, because when we have seen the drift of Russia-China relations, clearly now the shoe is on the other foot, in the sense that China is the dominant player, Russia remains a limited disruptor, Russia has limited instruments on which it operates. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, in what way does India taking a stand on this issue necessarily wedge them apart, that is Russia and China apart, or in what way does it strengthen Russia's hand in that relationship with China? I mean, I don't see where the congruence is. If at all, I would ask the question as to what have the Americans been doing to be able to drive Russia and China apart? If anything, you can see very clearly in the current context, the rank duplicity of the United States in dealing with Russia and China. They have been clobbering Putin with sanctions. Have they clobbered Xi Jinping with similar sanctions for what he's done, whether with the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang or the way they suppress things in Hong Kong? Did they go out, did the whole West go out hitting China from every corner? Did they ever move a resolution to throw China out of agencies of the UN? None of that happened. So the point is, if you want to actually reduce the importance of the China-Russia axis, then that's not going to come by essentially giving ultimatums to India. The question is, in what way are you doing strategic capacitation of players in this region which can keep the Russia-China alliance honest? For example, we could turn around and ask, when India was invaded, if I may use the word, or the incursion happened in Galwan, in what way did the Americans react beyond making statements? All the statements were pretty hollow. And even since then, even in the last 2 years, we've not seen any of the India-US mechanisms really get bolstered. Even the DTTI, which has now been reignited, there doesn't seem to be the signs of purposefulness to that. So the question that has to be asked is, even though Russia is a junior partner, that is a reality we have to live with for the next possibly few decades. The question is, how do we ensure that China is hemmed in? And that is something on which the United States still has not been able to come clear. It only expects India to take up fights with China, and this is going to be the same problem. Just like Europe has to live with Russia long term, we have a geographical reality, which is we have China on our border. And that's not going to end by India making certain strategic moves in this issue or any other issue.
Yeah, and as you said, India's position probably on this equation is very similar to what we did in 2003 or during the Vietnam War, for that matter. But this also brings into, question, there's some short-term implications of this entire war, especially the economic implications. I mean, we are a country, what I've read is that we import, energy obviously is one of the issues, the oil imports. Fertilizer, some of the government estimates say that our fertilizer subsidy may go up by almost 1 lakh crore this year. The spendings on that, which has not been accounted for thus far. And the strains were already there because of the sanctions on Iran. Now it's going to further create trouble. And the wheat, the food grain production, and then I think the corn also, we import a lot of corn from Ukraine, and that is used for chicken feed. Under these circumstances, And we've also seen, how the food scarcity or even the fertilizer scarcity, what havoc it can wreak in our neighboring country, in Sri Lanka, within the span of 1 year.
Absolutely.
So under these circumstances, what is it that India should, in short term, these are larger geopolitical issues that obviously diplomats are dealing with. But we have to prepare ourselves for, if this lingers on for a while. Obviously it will have implications, but if it goes on and drags on for a while. So what do you think that should be done as a preemptive measure?
Yeah, so I mean, we all understand that this particular conflict has hit us, or rather hit the global economy at the worst possible time, because just as COVID was beginning to subside and the world has been looking at some kind of a global recovery, albeit a very fragile recovery, this is only contributing to what I call as a double whammy effect. We are already still reeling from industrial supply chain disruptions which are China oriented, and you are seeing companies are still suffering from that. And now that is further compounded and accentuated by what we can call a kind of agrarian supply chain distress. So these are two key aspects for any economy to be able to maintain resilience and stability. So clearly our focus in the short term has to be, without looking to disturb equilibriums in the world, we have to put our country's national interest first. So we have to look at key countries from where we can ensure certain degree of food security and certain degree of energy security. And that's why we are hearing that a couple of our refiners, we're just looking at news, have actually now cut down on Saudi oil from next month onwards and are actually looking at buying more of Russian oil. Now that is not a statement we are making of Middle East versus Russia, but that's clearly looking at what is in our interest as we look to keep our budgets in control. So this will probably trigger more of Atmanirbharta prioritization within India. And this will take India away from simply looking at those sectors of industry and in terms of technology, but also realizing that along with industry and technology, you need Atmanirbharta even in areas like food security. So for example, we will have to look more carefully at Africa. And Africa is one of the areas. For example, when Prime Minister Modi did a deal with Philip Nyusi in Mozambique to deal with food security, there are a lot of areas now in the world which have not been looked at or explored, but they will open up as a result of Ukraine probably, not being part of the equation. So where doors close, certain doors open. So this will give a greater heft to Indian diplomacy to look beyond the normal players, to look at new players, but also see how we can ensure through resilience, through Atmanirbharta, that our agrarian and our energy security to a large extent is stabilized.
You mentioned that interesting point, because India's position more or less has been in a way endorsed or followed by countries like South Africa, Brazil, Mexico. And interestingly, within Asia, we find only 3 countries which have given unqualified support to the US. That is Korea, South Korea, Japan, and Singapore. So does it also, indicate towards, in a sense, what the Chinese or even the Russians have been calling, that we are moving towards a multipolar world sort of a situation?
Yeah, I mean, I would say more than a multipolar world, we're looking at more polycentricism, where basically you will still have 2 broad axes. You will have the US and their allies having one side, and you will have the Russians and the Chinese effectively on the other. And then you have a large band of middle powers, regional powers, who basically are going to use complex interdependence that we have in the world today to be able to stitch alliances which are based not so much on ideology or not so much on affinity, but more driven by where the national interests are. So what you're going to see is increasing, polarity which is emerging all around the world, but in different power centers. So for example, even in the Middle East, it was always, Israel versus the rest. And now you're seeing that even the subset of the Middle East is now becoming power-centric. So you're seeing, for example, in Iran, which if it probably does a JCPOA, gets mainstreamed into the politics along with Israel and along with Saudi Arabia and Qatar.
Yeah.
I mean, look at Qatar, for instance. Who would have said 3-4 years ago that Qatar would be playing such an important role? So what it's showing you is there is more than multipolarity. There is a certain polycentricity, and different regions are going to become important. And which of these alliances, the US alliance and the Russia-China alliance, is going to be able to build strategic depth is going to matter more. At the end of the day, the ASEAN way of doing things is probably going to be what every country is going to do, which is to effectively look at where your economic partners are and look at where your security partners are. And so that is the way the world is going to evolve more, rather than the characteristic formulation of a multipolar world, which we traditionally have all been used to.
Then one question to you. I mean, when we talk about this entire conflict, this also brings into, spotlight the way media wars are being fought. Interestingly, in the field of communication, the psych wars, uh, I would say, looking at the situation that is involved, probably the West was more prepared, or the Ukrainian side or the Western side was more prepared for an assault or the information assault by the Russians, especially after their experiences in the past. Uh, there have been instances of, deep fakes going viral from either side. I mean, it's not only the Ukrainian side, it's also, deepfakes of Putin going viral. You have, a new situation wherein you have videos, situational videos wherein somebody puts up a situational video of if Paris were to be attacked by the Russians, what would happen, And it's very, I mean, comparatively much easier to debunk or fact check a text, misinformation or disinformation vis-a-vis a video or an audio video misinformation. So how has, if you have been interacting with journalists there, how has the media been able to navigate its, course through this glut of information where a lot of information is actually misinformation and disinformation?
Kremlin has been very notorious from the start to, in terms of sharing fake news. Even with regards to the Bucha genocide, they said that they were not involved in it, and it's just a power play, a media play from the Ukrainian side. As for us, the EU has currently banned two, or actually three, of Kremlin's most supported newspapers. So in the traditional forms of media, we don't really come across much of these fake news. However, on Twitter, Twitter chatter, or even on other apps like Telegram and Signal, there's a lot of misinformation that's been circulated, as you rightly said, from both the sides. So indeed, when it comes to videos, you can still make out, but there are so many people who still believe in these videos. It's the classical example of WhatsApp University, as they say. A lot of fake news and news articles, videos, and messages have been forwarded. And even on a personal note, one of my flatmates is Russian, and she was explaining how her parents were 60 years old. They still believe in the Kremlin propaganda, and all that Putin has been calling it a special operations, and how that they're only helping a brother out in terms of seeing Ukraine as a brotherhood. So there's definitely a lot of fake media being circulated, and a lot of people who are actually biting into it. But then I think it remains on the media to fact check its sources for sure before circulating such things.
Then one question before I forget this, and which I think a lot of people would want to know, is that, initially when this conflict started, people said, and the Russians said that it's going to be over in 48 hours. So it has extended over a month. How do you think, and the information that you get, that the Ukrainians have been able to stand up? I mean, they have been able to stretch it for a month or more, even say 45 days, 50 days. And the more it stretches, the more problems probably it's going to create for Russia.
I think Russia grossly underestimated it. Really thought that it's going to be an in and out operation, and they're just going to have Kyiv in one day, and Ukrainians definitely proved them wrong. I think what's so special about how Ukrainians have been able to stand for so long is definitely how much support they're getting. Earlier, I would agree, it definitely started with most of the institutions and the EU just strongly condemning these attacks. But over the time frame, over the last 1 month, a lot of EU countries have extended their support to Ukraine. For example, both Poland and Bulgaria have bilateral agreements to send their MiGs and other fighter jets that the Ukrainian pilots know how to use to fight in the war. Czech Republic actually 2 days ago sent, I think, 20 tanks to Ukraine to fight the war. Even countries like Ireland that have a strict sending no weapons to conflict zones policy has definitely not sent any weapons, but it has not stopped the other EU nations from doing so either. And it has put 50 million of funds aside for other humanitarian assistance, like, safety kits and health kits and the like. Germany also has gone back on its policy and really supported Ukraine by providing it with weapons. And also it's taken quite a harsh decision on the part of the EU to stop the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which Germany as well, as we all know, invested quite a lot of money in it. But I think it's really the support of the EU and the neighboring countries that Ukraine has, and Ukraine itself, they've been doing it quite well, like the strategies.
It's interesting that she mentioned Germany, You think that, this conflict there is probably going to nudge even countries like Germany who have not, put in a lot of money in their defense budgets in the last 50, 60 years to think about it. And I think they're already doing that.
It's very interesting because firstly, Germany just had a change of government, and after a long time, so you have a new person in the saddle and he's in the spotlight. It's obviously a traffic lights coalition, so there are various pressures of pulls and things. But also this would lead to what I call as European autonomization. Okay. In fact, just before this happened, you've had the French, as a result of AUKUS, already pushing for greater European Union militarization. And in fact, they put in a plan for 2025, where they would like to see that although they work with NATO, they would like to have capacities very clearly and sharply distinguished from NATO. So the process of European militarization in terms of autonomous capacity was already underway, and now Germany quite clearly is kind of looking to spearhead it. But the longer issue is going to be that even if you militarize yourself, how do you decouple yourselves from what is today dependencies? And one of the things, that I sometimes joke to myself only is which of the decouplings, if at all, Europe is going to do faster? Are they going to decouple from Chinese technology and Huawei, which they said by 2026, 27, they will decouple? Or will they decouple from Russian energy faster? These are the two very important, kind of pillars on which European dependencies and vulnerabilities stand. So even when you militarize yourself, you will still have to ensure that these two areas are areas that you also deal with. Because as long as you're dependent on gas, and the Germans have been very honest in saying, look, even though we may be saying we want to decouple, our dependencies are going to continue for long years to come. And then technologies. When you are going to build military technologies, how are you going to do that by decoupling from technology per se? And one of the biggest handles that probably Russia has on Germany is through China. Because the level of dependence that Germans have on Chinese supply chains. I mean, Germany's biggest problem is it's the largest export economy in Europe with dependence on Chinese supply chains. So this Russia-China axis could actually be very strong in kind of keeping Germany constrained. So I'm still, a little bit doubtful on how far Germany is going to proceed as a result of this. Things may still settle down because Germany will have to go back to Nord Stream. Germany will have to go back to the same old, kind of things they've been doing with Russia and China.
But you think that in this entire, crossfire, one question which is generally, asked in India is that, the stand that we have taken, that that India cannot, afford to have unfriendly neighborhood, obviously. But this stand, does it imply that the West will not stand by India if it comes to a conflict or even some skirmishes with China? It's a very general perception or question which is, we asked.
Yeah, I mean, again, it boils down to what do you mean by stand by, If you stand by and watch, that is also stand by, So if you provide me solidarity, like how, Europe has been doing to Ukraine, saying we are with you, but in real terms, I mean, when NATO meets, for example, what came out of the NATO meet? Nothing much really came out of it. So I think India has realized after Galwan, particularly, the manner in which responses came, that it's only going to be about solidarity and nothing beyond that. So what you need to do, obviously, is to build your own capacities, to look at your own national interests first. And even though there is a broad affinity that we share with the West, in terms of the broad values of democracy, rule of law, etc., and the kind of world order we want to see, we know that every country in the region has their own limitations. So what we look at is two things. One, build your own capacities and look at your own national interests. But two, look to see how you pluralize the Indo-Pacific. So what we are doing is through these trilaterals. For example, when the India, Australia, France trilateral came about, which after AUKUS, seems to be suspended, and the India, Indonesia, Australia one. Now, these are just two examples. But I could quote even something in the Western Indian Ocean, how the Indians are now getting more integrated into the architecture there. So the idea is you pluralize these spaces, strategic spaces, have many countries participate, have, kind of relationship which are very, diverse with every country. But at the end of the day, have a very realistic expectation of what to anticipate in terms of standing by and support for you. Ultimately, it's yourself.
Interesting, last year, I think India celebrated 50 years of Indo-Soviet friendship, or the accord, peace accord. And there was one interesting aspect which was brought up by Jairam Ramesh in his book about the Russian foreign minister who was coming to India to sign this peace treaty. And there was probably information that on his way back, he would stop by Pakistan also, because Russians fancied their chances of, sort of balancing both India and Pakistan. And apparently, Mrs. Gandhi then had sent across a message that the treaty will not be signed if the Russian foreign minister were to, go for a stopover. So I think, yes, in a way that, as they say, that your interests are primary, ultimately in diplomacy and international politics, and everything else is temporary. So in that sense, you think that India has been able to leverage its position in the last 1.5 months?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you just see what happened in the last week of March. The number of diplomats who came calling on Delhi. You would think that Delhi was really the power that, held this whole solution in their hands. So it tells you that everyone wants to engage India, wants to keep India on their side. And they do believe that if today's India, which is now being very proactive in terms of operating its foreign policy and has no inhibitions about stating what it wants to state, I think that's the most important thing. India always was talked about as a country of principles. Now, principles are important, but principles to the exclusion of pragmatism means nothing. So what you have now is India still stating very good principles, but blending principles with pragmatic understanding of statecraft. And through that, many countries now want to associate. I mean, just look at it, to our east and to our west. Which countries can claim in the world that they have good relations both with Russia and the United States? Where you have basically the Russian foreign minister coming here, and as we know, on Monday, we have the 2+2 dialogue in Washington. At the same time, look at our Middle East policy. In fact, that's the most trickiest part of all. No country, including the United States, has managed to keep a relationship with Iran, with Saudi Arabia, with Israel, with all these players. But we have mutually beneficial relations with all of them. So that has come about through very conscious efforts to build your policy on national interest and to blend pragmatism with principle.
And every country does that. Even last year when the precursor to the US exit from Afghanistan, when the Russia called in for this extended troika in Doha, so it was said that it was under the Pakistani pressure that they did not invite India. I mean, they had their own compulsions because they wanted to keep Pakistan engaged as far as their relationship in managing Afghanistan post the US withdrawal is concerned. Thank you very much for joining us, Nan.
And just one more point on the point that you just now made, when Sergei Lavrov came to Delhi, and when they disagreed over the Indo-Pacific construct, and clearly Lavrov was headed then to Islamabad, and India did not appreciate that. India sent across a very subtle but still a not so subtle message when Jaishankar lands up in Georgia. With the artifacts. So the point is, you send a message that, okay, you want to engage Pakistan, we've got neighbors as well with whom we want to engage. We've sent similar messages to Turkey. I mean, when Turkey's been trying to be dirty with us, we said, okay, we are also going to engage with Armenia.
Yeah, I think we have a few questions here.
Okay.
I think the audience would want to ask. We can take a couple at least. Anybody having question?
Sir, one quick question, sir.
Yeah. Can you identify yourself?
Sir, my name is Akshay Alwa.
Yeah.
Sir, we've been enjoying the session, sir.
Yeah.
So my question is regarding NATO, pointed towards NATO. So we all know that Russia-Ukraine crisis is going on, but I think the body responsible for this would be NATO, because the foundational principle of NATO is an attack on one is tantamount to an attack on everyone. So NATO is headed by USA, but the other members of NATO are not pressurizing USA to intervene militarily, and nobody is holding NATO responsible for this. On the other hand, they're blaming India for being silent or for abstaining from the UNSC voting. So why is that so? So no one the other members of NATO are not holding USA responsible.
I think the question is that there seems to be no consensus even in the NATO. And that seems to be the case, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, look, the NATO principle that you talked about, an attack on one is an attack on all, will apply to the NATO community. Now, Ukraine is not part of NATO. So NATO, and this is a very difficult decision, if NATO decides to take any kind of military action in support of Ukraine, it would clearly indicate that NATO has made up its mind that Ukraine is going to be part of it, and that would only broaden the ambit of conflict. And Russia would then get a locus standi to hit those countries in the vicinity, which would be seen as supporting, operationally supporting Ukraine through NATO. So I don't think NATO has gone wrong there, but I agree with you. This whole problem is with regard to how NATO has tried to conduct itself. Bear in mind, this is a very important year for NATO. Of course, overtaken by events. The Spanish are right now holding the presidency of NATO. And in the June meeting, which is to happen, NATO was to come out with a new strategic concept where NATO is now openly talking about getting involved in the Indo-Pacific. Now look at that, when a Euro-Atlantic Western alliance, a transatlantic defense alliance, which was set up that far back with Soviet communism in mind, today says I'm going to go all around the world, hopping around, doing military operations and security containment. How do you build trust with other countries? When they say they're going to be part of the Indo-Pacific, it clearly becomes an American instrumentality for global hegemony. And it allows the like of Russia to say that this is exactly what the Americans want to do. So NATO has to also cool down itself. NATO has to build trust. Just as Russia needs also to build trust, NATO needs to build trust, because NATO was created against the Soviet Union. And in the last 30 years, what NATO has done is only look to expand its frontiers. And that is why I say we must always remember the concept of a buffer state. We are paying the price for losing a buffer state in terms of Tibet. You know what's happened. I mean, Mao's palm and five fingers strategy becomes that much more easier for them to conduct because we lost a buffer state like Tibet. The Russians purely understand that if Ukraine goes into NATO or Ukraine gets absorbed into the Western alliance, it's not simply any country being absorbed. It's effectively bringing NATO on the frontiers of Russia. And which part of Russia? The part of Russia not that is far-flung in Siberia, the part of Russia that has Russian industries, Russian population, and so Moscow and St. Petersburg will be within range. How did NATO try to address this? I, for one, would say when the war clouds were building and when world leaders were trying to call up President Putin, that is when NATO needed to have a frank chat, not just Blinken with Lavrov, but there needed to be NATO talking to Russia about how they can restructure their relations. But I guess NATO did not take that seriously till the very end. As Nayan also said, probably the expectation was that Putin won't go the whole hog, that somehow he will stop, and now things have unraveled. So now the dysfunctionality of trust is so poor that one can't see how the NATO-Russia relationship can really be repaired without NATO making major concessions.
Any other questions?
If I could just add to it.
Yeah, just
Address that Putin gave to Russia. He said that Russians don't feel safe to develop and exist, particularly because now they're going to have Ukraine, which was asking to be a member of NATO, right at its neighborhood. They asked NATO to reject Ukraine as its member, to not accept Ukraine as a member, but also the EU. And this is basically why the invasion started in the first place, because Ukraine wants to be a part of the NATO and the EU. And I agree with Dr. Datesh that NATO should have definitely held this dialogue way before the actual war even began.
thank you.
It had full potential to be solved before.
Yeah, please.
Okay. My name is Rahul Suma. I'm a law student. So as you mentioned, India has a very good relationship with both US and Russia. So how do you think India should take a stand in the rupee-ruble deal which is proposed by Russia?
Look, the rupee-ruble deal is not simply just a bilateral arrangement. It must be seen in the larger context of what is the refinancialization of the world system. I mean, we all know that the process of de-dollarization, as we say, is underway. I mean, the pace, we can all debate whether the pace is fast enough, slow enough, etc. But there is a move away from the dollar by countries of the world. Now, the problem that you have is with the Chinese and the Russians now trying to create alternative payment gateways. India would not like to foreclose all its options, by just going headlong into a rupee ruble kind of arrangement that will then draw us into the Chinese financial system. The last thing we want is in any way to be, leveraged into the Chinese financial system. So we are watching it right now, which is why what we've said, we'll do individual deals. We will look at them only in terms of, let's say, energy, but we are not getting into an institutional arrangement on the financial sector with Russia or with China, because that is something that doesn't sit well with an economy like ours and the kind of economy that we want to create, which is certainly not the Chinese model and certainly not the Russian model. Any other questions?
Yeah, I'm Ravi. I'm representing the Mythic Society. See, on one side, the NATO, the West, it's debased. They have put the downtrodden face today, right? On the other side, unexpectedly, the war is prolonged, and probably as per the reports, Russia is unable to really do, and they don't know their way forward. On the other side, you notice that India, Russia, and the Chinese, this probably the territorial area is becoming more and more stronger. And the weight of the whole globe is shifting towards this. So, what do you think about the prospects of India in the coming decade, looking into the current scenario and the way India is currently behaving or performing in the whole scenario?
Yeah, see, as I said, right now, as a middle power, India is basically, tiptoeing its way through all these tensions. But as India's economy grows, as we become a $5 trillion economy, a $7 trillion economy, clearly we will have more heft at the table. We are also getting more integrated within regional structures and within the larger global architecture. So that obviously gives India a lot more say at the head table. But the very fact that India is a very interesting proposition, where India obviously remains an exemplary democracy, which has its own pull, and yet at the same time is able to, at least is progressing towards building a vibrant society. That combination, I think, gives India the best ability to be able to balance and bring equilibrium between the Russia-China axis of autocracies on the one side and the Western democracies who are, in a sense, losing their sheen, they're losing their vibrancy. So while values of the West are important, the West is no longer seen as able to carry those values with a degree of robustness. Those values probably will be carried in the Indian context through Indian civilizational approach by India. But at the same time, India's ability to speak autonomously, India's ability to articulate its convictions clearly, also means that it is a country that the Chinese need to be wary of within Asia. And if you see what the Chinese have done recently, they're also looking to find some way out, right, of this current situation, and also the Russians, in terms of how the Russians are coveting us. So India, let's say in 2030, or India in 2040, is definitely a stronger India, but an India which will not be a camp follower. So I think one thing is very clear, that India won't be a camp follower, but India will not follow any, listless kind of balancing also. India is going to be at the head table, articulating its own interests, and working with both sides without picking sides, which is why I think the best comment that was made by Dr. Jaishankar, both a few days ago, where he said we are on the side of peace. But I would just take you back to a concept that he introduced at Gateway House when he was having a conversation with Dr. Raja Mohan, where he said, he was asked, describe India going forward. And he said, India is a southwestern power. Now, as in, we can engage with the West today, not like before where we had inhibitions of the West. We articulate with the West with confidence, but we also know that we have a big obligation to the global South. And the global South is the long, stretch of developing countries whose aspirations at the high table we also reflect. So I would say India in 2030 or India in 2040 would be that kind of a southwestern power, which is unique in its own way.
Hello, sir. Yeah, this is Adarsh Shagde. So my question to you is now that considering the present political and war situation in Russia and Ukraine, what do you think that after the war, the India's position and India's stance will be like? We are in the BRICS and we are in the Quad, and we hear a lot of news that the America is pressurizing India to take sides on neutral or against Russia. So how India will react post-war?
Would you want to say anything first? Maybe Nayan, something?
I think, as Dr. Dardesh had mentioned before, that post-war India is definitely going to be much stronger and move towards more Atmanirbhar policies. Because if this war has made anything clear, it is definitely that every country has to be independent in most of the fields. Because, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so the current, can you hear me audible? I personally feel that there is a certain realization post-Afghanistan that this is as far as the NATO or the Western countries are going to go, as far as India's own obligations and issues with its immediate neighbors are concerned. Which is why, I mean, that was very interesting that at the same point in time, Imran Khan, the Pakistani Prime Minister, was in Russia. And some say that he was there at the goading of the Chinese. You know, there have been reports to that effect. Imran Khan himself gave a backhanded sort of compliment to India when he said, obviously that was meant for the Pakistani military, when he said that, he praised the Indian foreign policy, saying that, it is very independent and it has put its own national interest first and foremost. So I think this war, obviously, this conflict obviously is going to end. It's going to have the short-term ramifications, economic ramifications. But geopolitically, I think there is a realization in India that it has to leverage its position, keeping in mind that the West and the NATO have, to a certain extent, decided and deciphered to the extent where they are going to get engaged. Yeah. And to what extent? Geopolitically, where and to what extent? And it has to, in that way, leverage its position with other powers. It could be Russia, it could be China, or an axis of many countries. I think that's the way I look at it.
You want to? Since the talk was specifically, you said BRICS and Quad. See, something very interesting is also emerging. Groupings are emerging on the world stage, they're mushrooming. But you're also seeing groupings become very functional. So groupings are not driven by old geopolitical notions. So for example, Quad. What are the geographical dimensions of Quad? There are no real geographical dimensions. It is basically a concert of democracies who come together. And although Quad is quadrilateral security dialogue, you see increasingly at the summit level when they're meeting, they're not really discussing security. In fact, the 5 pillars that they have now built are on issues which have more to do with society, which have more to do with building resilient economies, which is more about supply chain disruptions, dealing with that, dealing with critical technologies and how to secure that. So what you are seeing with groupings emerging now are not the typical zero-sum game, in the past, where I win, you lose. We are now talking of win-win options. And in win-win options, the BRICS and the Quad both can coexist. The BRICS have their own win-win propositions. It requires mature diplomacy, which I definitely believe India today has through its foreign service and through the political leadership, to be able to, maximize options through BRICS and yet know where the limits of BRICS are, and to similarly do the same with Quad, realizing fully well that for all the big talk, at the end, the most interesting thing was when Japan said that we will not cut off our energy ties with Russia in terms of the Kuril Islands, there was an interesting comment made, will Biden call Japan shaky? Biden went and called India shaky. Well, his cornerstone treaty ally, Japan, is saying we are not going to break off ties totally with Russia. Does he have the same gumption to go and call Japan shaky? So there is duplicity in everything. The question is, India is now looking at this. India is calling this duplicity out, and India is saying, we are not going to carry the can for the West. Just as you have the right to find your own maneuverability, we will also find our own maneuverability between the Sino-Russian axis and the Western axis, keeping India's interests paramount.
Yeah.
My question is around.
I think it's not on.
So, Shantling Patil, and my question is, we all know that before the war started, Ukraine population was around 43 million, and now almost around 5 million, more than 5 million have migrated. They are immigrants somewhere in the European countries, right? Now, if the war continues for another 1 month or 2 months, we don't know to how long it will continue. Will it put pressure on the European Union or the European countries? Because the population of some of the European countries itself is not more than 1 or 2 million. The population of migrants will be more than the native population. Will it put pressure on the European countries? That was my first question. And the second is, I mean, the humanitarian crisis which we will be seeing if this war continues, uh, will we be responsible for not doing enough to contain? Will we, in the sense the European Union and the US or the entire world, will be held responsible by the next generation for not doing enough to contain this crisis? And the third and final is, how can we trust the Russian defense system when they are not able to finish the war? I mean, complete the war where they expected it to be, I mean, done in in a week. So it is, I mean, extending more than a month now. We don't know how many more months it will continue.
Well, I think we have trusted the Russian equipment system for 70 years, I think.
No, I mean, we trusted, but again,
So we have been,
we trusted not in the sake of a war, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we have used their mix and everything in the
yeah,
war.
I'll
But
ask Nayan to take the first questions on the migrants. You know, how much, how many and for how long uh, the European Union nations can take it?
I would answer your second question first about, where the generational blame lies. I think that out of goodwill, a lot of countries are trying to help Ukraine, especially what I see in the European Union. A lot of general public, the civilians have opened their homes to the refugees that are incoming, and they have been sharing the resources that they have. They've been helping them find jobs, having them stabilize. I've also seen people offering, language classes so that the refugees can better integrate with the society that they live now. But for sure, it remains to be seen how long can this go on for, because definitely there's no doubt about it that it's going to put a strain on the resources of these countries. But we need to also see that, like, for example, Germany and Belgium, for example, they have a lot of Turkish population that has been living there from generations. And although, of course, it's more mouths to feed for the state, it's not putting as much pressure on the state, because if it was, the European Union had these policies in place where they shared the burden. So as of now, because the war is still fresh, it's still ongoing, of course, a lot of countries are without any restraints accepting refugees. But I think if the crisis is to continue for a much longer time, they would definitely put some policies, some constraints in place, and they would deal it. But it remains to be seen how. Coming back to the generational blame, well, I think people can see that, everyone has a good heart. They're trying to help. But of course, if you talk about Ukrainians, they probably would talk about the goodwill. But if you're supposed to talk about the upcoming Czech or Polish generations with living with refugees, probably not having a lot more competition than they would have without them, there's a different kind of blame. So there's no right or wrong question to this no right or wrong answer to this question.
Well, Prime Minister Modi seems to have encouraged when he said that Putin and Zelensky should negotiate or talk directly. So the question that has come, that has India done enough? How would you respond to that? Do you think?
Let's also be a little realistic. I mean, when was the last time India got itself involved in any kind of serious mediation? I mean, this talk of mediation has not been new. For some time back, when the Middle Eastern peace process between Israelis and Palestinians was being talked about, and the quartet, the World Quartet, had put in place a roadmap, there was also talk that both the Palestinians and the Israelis would be happy to have India as one of the mediators. The question is, firstly, to be able to mediate, you may enjoy the trust of both parties, but how deeply are you invested and engaged with both parties? Certainly, India is not deeply engaged in that part of the world. I mean, if you look at, for example, India's Europe policy for a long time has been Western Europe. The likes of Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, In fact, because of the evacuation, our ministers were there. Otherwise, for a long time, what we call as the Visegrad, for instance, I mean, our relations with the Visegrad Four, or for that matter, even with, the Balkans countries, has been very, very minimal. So let's be realistic. To be able to be a mediator, you need to have stakes in the process. The world may say good things, but in terms of real operationality, we don't have that stakes. We can be part of an international coalition. Suppose that, for example, like you had on Korea, you had the repatriation committee. Now, if something like that is put in place for confidence building, India can be part of that kind of a coalition and can contribute to coalition building. Because look at, for example, Afghanistan. Ultimately, the demand that has been made on Taliban is the demand that actually got reflected and embodied in UNSCR 2593. And 2593 was approved on the last day of our presidency when Harsh Shringla was in New York. So, and that has become the international position with regard to Taliban. So India can leverage its influence, India can leverage its good offices without necessarily being an intervened mediator. I don't think we have that stake right now, and I think nobody is entertaining that also. So we could be part of a larger process.
Thank you. You have another question?
Sir, hello sir. Sir, namaste.
Hello, sir. Sir, global perception of the Russia-Ukraine wars has become one-sided, maybe because of how NATO and West combined have narrated it. What actually is Russian side of the state and why that narration has been shadowed?
I think Nayan will want to take that question. It's basically about the narrative that is coming out in the media. I think if you were to look at the narrative which is emerging in the Chinese media also, it is, I think, a little pro-Russia, the way TikTok has been used, or even the Chinese state media. So what we get to hear is essentially, what we are getting from the Western media outlets, our perception or the source of information. So, I mean, one side calls the other the propagandist, the other side calls the other side propagandist. So that has been going on. So it reminds me of a very interesting conversation which I had. I was at that time on a fellowship abroad. So Russia was investing heavily on RTV, on its international television, English television. And the European countries or the Western democracies were the first, in fact, to realize the soft power of media, communications. So for instance, it was, not by chance that 50 years back, BBC or the Voice of America would invest a lot of money on Hindi services, on Hindi radio services. Now, as India has moved closer to these countries, so they invest money on Pashto services or not the Hindi services. Hindi services have now stopped telecasting. So these are, even in terms of communication, they have their strategic interest, and that's how they appropriate money also. So this conversation there was a Guardian correspondent who was thrown out of Russia, of Moscow by Putin. It was in, I think, 10 years back. I forgot Harding, I forgot his name.
Simon Harding, I think.
Yeah, I forgot his name. So he had come over and he was, telling us, talking to us about this RTV, the way aggressively it was hiring some Western journalists, English-speaking journalists. And he had this conversation with this girl who was joining there as a chief of bureau for the RTV. And he asked her, what were the reasons why she was joining RTV? And she had a very interesting answer. He said that, it's not about the story. It's basically about two competing narratives at the end of the day. And one narrative prevails. So you are pushing one narrative, the other side is pushing the other narrative. Obviously, the truth has been a casualty in this entire conflict, the way it has evolved due to the internet disruption. But yes, that's the way how it has been. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, the power of media. I mean, just look at, for example, Al Jazeera's entry. Till Al Jazeera had entered the space in the 21st century, you had basically the BBC and CNN who held all sway. And then you talked about aggressive, kind of recruiting. That's what Al Jazeera did as well. Yeah. They went in and did aggressive, because money was not an issue. They recruited people from BBC, from CNN who just moved overnight. And the way in which Al Jazeera has become an instrument to peddle a narrative, during the Arab Spring, we all saw that. Now, in the case of this, I would still venture, because having watched a lot of media, I would say in India it was still okay in the sense you had Russian presence here on our national media. Russians were coming out aggressively and countering the Ukrainian narrative, the Western narrative. You may not have found that so much in other countries, because first thing they did was Russian TV was banned. So one of the things, it basically went off air. So the moment it went off air, it was very difficult to access it. So that was the one problem. The second, obviously, is when it comes to a certain narrative, there is obviously a setting of morality. And the West, for a long time, regardless of what they do, have always been quick and better at creating themselves as the epitome of morality. So they step in there and they create themselves as this kind of shining star on a pedestal, and then make you devilish. So everything that Putin has talked about, you see, for example, the reporting on Putin, what Putin is, how Putin has come about, but no one has ever talked about what triggered Putin. The fact remains, what triggered Putin into this, there have been two Putins over 20 years. The Putin until 2005, from 2001 to 2005, and the Putin from 2006 till now. The first 5 years of Putin was one where Putin was looking to find some middle ground with the West, which is why he offered the Americans military bases in Central Asia immediately after 2001. And yet what happened? Between 2003 and 2005, we saw that regimes in what he considers his periphery were toppled by the United States, whether it's in Kyrgyzstan, whether it's in Georgia, and puppet regimes were brought in. So in 2006, Putin changed, and changed in a sense for the better in terms of taking on the Americans. So this ability to control the narrative has always been a strong point of the West, but I would say look at it case by case. For example, Latin America, which is a place I follow a lot. RT has made huge inroads in Latin America, and there the Western narrative has not worked. That's why I like the fact, that the Russians have been now saying, okay, you say the world is against us. Let's look at it. Where is the Africans against us? Where are the Latin Americans against us? Even population-wise, let's go around the world and see who is against us. So they have shown actually in color codes that which parts of the world has spoken out against Russia. The Indians have not spoken out against Russia. Africa has not spoken out against Russia. Latin America has not spoken out against Russia. And even large parts of Asia has not spoken out against Russia. So who is this world opinion? The United States and Europe is world opinion. In terms of population also, what is their population? So, there are ways to counter narratives. So I would say, rather than making a sweeping generalization, look at it region-wise, and you will probably get a better picture of which narrative succeeds where.
Hello, sir. Namaste. Kaushik here.
In terms of media.
Sorry?
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Nine, yeah.
Yes, we can.
As you can see in terms of media, this has also been quite a new age war because it's also been largely on social media, from Zelensky addressing the Grammys, but also holding these talks, but also, the younger generation making memes about everything. I feel like most of us who don't actively follow the news get their information from these memes, and then they can either be pro or against Russia, So it's very important that you check your sources where the news comes from, and then of course it remains on you to believe it or not.
About, rather than a particular news or an event, I think it's what they're trying to do, both sides. It's like a, small trickle, drop by drop. You're trying to, occupy that space and create a perception about NATO, the other side trying to create a perception about Russia. And that's how, this war is being fought in the media space.
Definitely, I would agree. And it's also a lot of information overload, Like they have filled Twitter channels, they've filled Telegram, Signal with all sorts of news that it becomes really difficult to track the source and originality of each of it. So for sure.
It's really challenging for journalists this time around. Yeah, I think...
Sir, Kaushik here. I have one question, sir. What is your opinion about genocide in Ukraine as published in newspapers?
I think the Bucha...
Yeah, look, it's just come to light. We will need an investigation, and that's what India has said. We need an investigation which is international and independent. It cannot be either the Russian view or the Ukrainian view. But obviously what has come to light is horrific. It clearly shows that much more worse things have been done than what we knew at first count. But I would also say that based on the track record of what has happened to independent investigations over the years, I don't really know how far this will go. This will still become a Russian view versus the US or a Western view. Rafiq Hariri was killed in Lebanon. That investigation went to nothing. There have been many, for example, Jamal Khashoggi. I mean, his death now, Turkey has transferred the case back to Saudi Arabia. So I don't know, it's definitely condemnable. It is going to be condemned, and this is where I feel India has shown how unique its stand is. For example, even yesterday when Ambassador Tirumurti spoke, he was very clear that one of the reasons probably India was not going the whole hog with Russia this time was because of what has happened in Bucha, what has come to light. So India felt that this time when it was talking about UNHRC, if it would have totally gone the Russian side, Russia was pushing that we should support them, it would have been misunderstood that India does not really stand up for human rights. Maybe if Bucha had not come about, India's view might have been different on voting yesterday in the HRC.
But you think that this could probably be the turning point? I mean, the Russians would be facing the heat now, the way it is prolonging?
I think this will be, because by all accounts, it's very evident now that even though we may say independent investigation, we know what's happened. I mean, you have an intuitive sense. I think this is going to hurt them a lot internationally. It's going to make them look absolutely bad and barbaric. It will also make countries like India a little more defensive in terms of what position we take with them. But in terms of ultimately, establishing accountability, I don't think that's going to go anywhere. Because whom are you going to establish accountability with? The International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice. The Russians couldn't care. The Russians will continue with impunity, just like the Americans have done over the years. So how are you going to establish accountability? How are you going to get to the bottom of this? Let's remember, the Russians have been classically known to poison people. We've seen how the poisoning attacks have happened, right? There was no accountability there. You can't really go and catch any of these people. So at the end of the day, the survivors obviously will have to be given some kind of compensation. But beyond that, I don't know how do you establish culpability and accountability.
One last question before I end this session. How do you see this crisis in the short term, these hostilities ending? You see, they're crystallizing somewhere in some shape?
Yeah, I think clearly the Russians have realized that the whole goal of basically taking Zelensky out, possibly taking control of Kyiv, putting a new government, that's out of the question now. So now it seems to be what we all know, regrouping basically. I think they will settle on a buffer. They'll probably want a buffer, and that buffer is eastern Ukraine. Not just eastern Ukraine, but as the French Defense Ministry has put out that map overnight, where they have looked at the three most important goals. Basically, what the Russians wanted was a clear land bridge to Crimea, which they now have under control. They would like to control the entire Black Sea, given that chance. Then that becomes a player there. They now control the Sea of Azov. They now want to control the entire Black Sea. And third is to create as big a buffer as possible between them and what is Western Ukraine. So I can see this ending in terms of probably Zelensky doing what everyone expects, which is accepting neutrality, which he probably should have looked at more seriously at the very beginning. Clearly Zelensky probably accepting that Crimea is gone because there's no way Crimea is coming back, and agreeing to some kind of a autonomous kind of a hold of Donbas region without necessarily signing that thing off to Russia. Accepting that Donbas is different and Donbas will be able to decide its own future. I think that's the only way this is going to end, and I think it's heading towards that. Even the Russians have realized, so the Russians want to keep peace talks going. The Russians themselves are saying we see merit in it. I mean, that's Sergei Lavrov's statement. Yeah. So I think it's going to end up with gains on the ground, military gains on the ground for Russia, but not being able to actually bring about regime change, which is what the Russians wanted in Kyiv, to be able to change Ukraine's behavior. That would have happened only if they had toppled Zelensky.
Thank you, Dr. Balka. I think
one more thing, just to end on this. For all we know, I think we might have found our Nobel Peace Prize winner for this year in the month of December. I think the West will want to give it to Zelensky. That will be again the part of the narrative, that he is the peacemaker. So you never know. I mean, the way peace prizes are given, I won't be surprised if in December, in October when it's announced, it will be Zelensky. So,
Sir,
I think we have a question.
Yeah, the US has been pushing India to take its stand against Russia and has also gone a step ahead and stated that Russia might not be in Indian support of China violates LAC. Can you spread some light on the actual impact?
Sorry,
I couldn't get the question.
Yeah, could you just repeat the question again, please?
Yeah, sure. The US has been pushing India to take a stand against Russia and has also gone a step ahead and stated that Russia might not be in India's support if China violates LAC. Can you spread some light on the actual impact?
Yeah, I mean, this is basically Dalip Singh, who basically was here, and the Americans saying that, look, you're trusting the Russians too much. The Russians ultimately will bolt on you. But let's also keep in mind that at a very crucial stage after Galwan, when Galwan happened, the Russians kept the arms flow going. I mean, when Rajnath Singh was sent there, and Rajnath Singh went for the parade as well, it was a very critical moment. It was, and I know as well from own interactions how strongly the Chinese were pushing with the Russians to at least send a message to India that weapons flow will not happen. Your ordinances will not come. And Russia was very clear in saying that all our agreements would be fulfilled. We will not balk on any of them. So we would go by the empirical record that Russia has stood by us in a very critical moment. We would ask the counter question, in what way has America, changed its behavior after Galwan? Galwan was a message to America also. It was not just a message to us, it's a message to America, because we are not the same Quad country. We are a unique Quad country. We are the only Quad country which actually has a land border with China. So we face a challenge from China on continental and maritime dimensions. So we can ask the question to the Americans that instead of lecturing us, you should look back and say, how have India-US relations changed after Galwan? And I don't see a fundamental change either. So our policy has to be a policy where we engage the Americans, but we also build diversification and engage the Russians also to minimize China's ability to hurt us the next time around.
I think we've taken all the questions. Thank you, Dr. Daktesh. I think we've exceeded. Yeah, please.
What's the consequences of such wars on the youth? As we know, India has become the highest youth population. So can you tell the influence of such wars in the youth?
I couldn't get the question. Can you repeat it?
What do these wars achieve really?
Well,
I mean, look, those who are peddling, and I'll just probably bring a very interesting, instance here. When COVID first began, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, he moved a resolution where he was challenging the major powers of the world and saying, at least use this COVID instance now to bring many of these civil wars and other wars to an end. None of the countries were able to agree because everyone has fingers in the pie. But the idea was what? You have these intra-state civil wars that are happening that are basically having a huge humanitarian security cost. The wars that we are seeing of these kind, which are between armies, is essentially of those countries who are still driven by old notions of how wars are done. For them, wars are not human cost. For them, wars are territory on the ground. So for Putin, for instance, it's not really about how many people die. It's about he looking at buffer states, looking at geography in the old ways we look at geography. That I want to ensure my security. How does my security get ensured? My security is ensured by creating as big a buffer between Russia and European frontiers. So for that, he could go to any extent. So the problem is this, that until we understand the human cost, and the human cost is not only in terms of dead bodies, that's the visible human cost. The human cost is not only in terms of refugees who have left Ukraine. The human cost is in terms of internal displacement. True. I mean, IDPs and internally displaced people cause a lot of disruptions which we cannot even imagine. Economic dislocation, social dislocation. For example, it can also change politics.
Food scarcity.
Yeah, food scarcity, exactly. And it can change politics. I mean, for example, this Sunday, France is going to vote in its first round of elections. And Marine Le Pen, who used to be a xenophobic, far-right leader, who was a supporter of Putin all these years, has found it difficult to be in defense of Putin. And she's had to take a stand which is much more favorable in favor of Ukrainian refugees, and that is delivering her some political dividends. So the displacement can cause a lot of dislocation. But to answer your point, these are still approaches of old nations, Western nations, who still see wars as conquest of territory, and they don't look at the human cost of what happens as a result of it.
Is it associated with the traditional, conventional concept of the nation state, the flag, the language, the territory?
It is still territorial. It is still largely territorial. So while we see, a nation state in terms of civilization. Now let me give an example. When we talk of influence, like in 2006, 2007, when he gave an interview, President Putin, he said, my view of Russian influence is very simple. My influence extends to all those territories beyond Russia where Russian people live and where Russian language is spoken. In many senses, that is very similar to how even we see ourselves. We are very proud of our civilizational heritage that has gone east and gone west. But where's the difference? We are not going to do occupations and hegemonize those areas to reassert our influence. We are happy with Nirantar and Chirantar influence which we have had to continue as a narrative. We are not going to go and say that because there was Gandhar Naresh in Afghanistan, so that part of Afghanistan should belong to India. But in the Russian mindset, they are very clear, wherever Russian people live, wherever Russian language is spoken, if there is a threat to those areas, we will occupy them physically. So that's the difference between civilizational views which are timeless and those who see civilization as a corporatized entity, where you have to achieve goals in a particular point of time. Thank you.
What would you just said now? Yeah. How do you relate it to India in Pakistan?
Look, I mean, obviously that is our part. We have to take it back, but then you also have to look at the reality of how you're going to do it. I mean, for instance, when Ladakh, when the bifurcation of J&K happened, what was keeping the Chinese up at night? And when I used to talk to some Chinese professors whom I would meet with, all the time their question would be, what is your next step on POK? So sometimes you can take a step and that step can convey a lot of messages. Now on POK, that part definitely has to be part of us. But the question is, are you going to go the military route in today's times? Is it even feasible that you will do it the military route? Because remember, there is every possibility that now Kashmir is no longer bilateral. We say it's bilateral, but Pakistan has ensured that it is trilateral. By getting the Chinese into CPEC, what the Chinese have done effectively is to say there are now three parties here. We have stakes on the ground. So the next time you do any adventure in POK or choose to do anything there, it's not going to be Pakistan versus you. We will step in saying we are also there. So in a sense, it has been complicated. That whole area has been complicated. But on the civilizational aspect, like we say Akhand Bharat. Now, many people think Akhand Bharat is some kind of revisionism where India is going to go and occupy all lands. There is no question of occupying anybody. But there is a kind of a civilizational influence that is within, that is ingrained within the people who live in that part of the world. So that is the difference between a civilizational understanding of India and possibly a civilizational understanding of the Russians, which is very territory oriented.
I think.
Thank you, audience. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause to our speakers for engrossing such a power-packed discussion. Now I request Captain Brijesh Chauta, trustee of Bharat Foundation, to honor our dignitaries with a memento as a token of respect. Thank you. Delegates, kindly note, you all can tweet your thoughts on the discussion taking place on Mangalore Litfest with a hashtag MLR Litfest 2022. I repeat, hashtag MLR Litfest 2022.
Thank you.
ಈ ಗೋಷ್ಠಿ ಇಲ್ಲಿಗೆ ಮುಕ್ತಾಯವಾಗಿದೆ.